Homer's Iliad is not the entire story of the Trojan War. So today I'm going to talk about Homer's Iliad, but a little bit about what happens before the sort of beginning of the stories that lead up to the war, the mythical backgrounds, that foolish judgment of Paris, the nature of the character of Helen, how the army gets together, and the first 9 years they spend together fighting before the events of the Iliad begin. And I'll cover a little bit about the end of the story, a bit today, a bit next time. The wooden horse, the actual sack of the city, and the nostoi, which is a term for the returns of the Greek generals, because a lot of them are kind of fraught. Along the way, I'll talk about that guy Schliemann, and a bit about Homeric poetry and its nature. So terminology can be a little bit confusing with the Trojans and with the Greeks, because Troy is named Troy for Tros, one of the kings in the line of Dardanus, but the epic will refer to them as Dardanians as well. Dardanus is a son of Zeus and Electra. As the founder of Troy, he's somewhat superhuman. And there's another guy named Ilus. So we call it the Iliad because of the town's name, Ilion, named for Ilus. Sometimes they'll refer to the town as Pergamum. That should just refer to the citadel itself. A lot of towns have a Pergamum, a central citadel, but usually you'll see that to mean the whole city-state of Troy. And so I'll talk about the Trojans myself generally without referring to most of these other terms that you run into in your reading. The Iliad and the Odyssey are both involved in the epic of the Trojan War, but there are a lot of other tales that come into that. We've lost most of the poems of the epic cycle, whole epic poems that covered the before and the after and the during of the Trojan War story. The 5th century Athenian tragedians use single events that go on as plot devices for their various plays, where we've seen some of that, and we're going to see more. What Aeschylus calls slices from the great banquet of Homer. I personally work on the small poems of lyric poets, and a lot of them deal with events and personalities in the Trojan War. And of course, we need to deal with somebody like Herodotus, who uses the Trojan War as a historical event to rationalize problems between East and West that lead up to the Persian Wars. As you read in Apollodorus, Priam and his wife Hecuba have a first child, Hector, who is wonderful, and then a second baby. And Hecuba had a dream in which she was giving birth to a torch that burned the whole city. And he grew up kind of awesome. Paris was also called Alexander, the defender of man, because he could defend. He was a shepherd defending his flocks and apparently repelled humans from humans. He had been left on a mountainside and then recognized by his parents eventually. So he's brought back into the fold in time to destroy his city. Another prophecy is really important. Prometheus knew that the goddess Thetis, a Nereid, a sea goddess, would bear a child greater than his father. And so Zeus wanted to nail Thetis, and Prometheus was the one who knew that that was a bad idea, that if Zeus did that, then the Olympians would be overthrown by a greater god. So what do you do when you're Zeus? He gave Thetis to a mortal man, figuring no problem there. So he gave Thetis to Peleus, the son of Aeacus, so that the child wouldn't pose a problem, and averted the sort of problems of the succession myth that we saw in the Theogony, son overthrowing father. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis was the greatest event of its time, and all the gods were invited, except for Eris. Eris, the goddess of discord, because, you don't want discord at your wedding. But you also don't want to not invite the goddess of discord to your wedding, because she'll get pissed. And so Eris shows up at the wedding anyway with a golden apple, and on it is written, "For the most beautiful." She sees a gaggle of goddesses and tosses the apple over. and three hands reach down to claim the prize, claiming they're the most beautiful: Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite. They go to Zeus and they say, pick which one of us is the most beautiful so we know who gets the apple. And he says, I'm not a dumbass. I'm not picking between my daughter and my other daughter and my wife and my sister. So go find some dumbass mortal to choose. And so they make their way down to the area around Troy where they find Paris in a meadow taking care of his sheep. And they say, who's most beautiful? Of course, being goddesses, they're not going to leave this to chance. And so they bribe him, each one individually. Athena says, I will grant you wisdom and conquest over the Greeks. Hera says, I will give you dominion over all of Asia. And Aphrodite says, I will give you the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Understand that Paris at this point is a shepherd on Mount Ida, happy with his sheep and with his girlfriend, who's a nymph of some sort. You read about her in Parthenius. Oinone, a nymph. As you know, she's going to punish him for running off eventually. When he's mortally wounded, eventually, he goes to her for healing, and she just lets him die, and then regrets it and kills herself. Romance novels have nothing on ancient Greek emo. Anyway, Paris chooses Helen. Chooses Aphrodite to get Helen. The goddesses disappear and nothing happens for a bit. But when Paris later goes on a diplomatic mission to Sparta, he abducts or seduces or coerces Helen, and she leaves behind her family and comes to Troy with him, thus sealing the bargain he has made. So Paris chooses Helen, and Helen's abduction sets the Trojan conflict going. So who is Helen? There we need to start with Leda. Leda is a queen of Sparta. Her husband, Tyndareus, I guess, is out of the picture for a little bit, and she is approached by Zeus. I mean, Helen's divine beauty is not a metaphor. Being the daughter of Zeus, she's heroic and semi-immortal herself. Yeats puts it, this is the beginning of the Trojan War, started by the rape of Helen's mother, continued by the rape of Helen herself, culminating in the destruction of a city. In this reading, in Yeats's reading, male brutality towards women only serves to destroy the political instantiation of masculine power in the form of a city, which almost sounds nice. Anyway, Zeus comes to Leda in the form of a swan. That's kind of gross. I don't know what to make of that. She eventually gives birth, according to some traditions, to 2 eggs. And inside one egg are Helen and Pollux, the children of Zeus and Leda, while in the other are Clytemnestra and Castor, the children of Leda and her mortal husband Tyndareus. Helen is the object by which the prophecies concerning Troy's destruction come to pass. Helen's culpability in the Trojan War has been much discussed, even in antiquity, even in the Iliad itself. Here, I'm quoting Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? I mean, she causes the Trojan War. Her beauty destroys a city, launching 1,000 Greek ships just to destroy a city. But there's so much more to Helen. I mean, she was apparently the most beautiful woman in the world before she was a woman. And so even before she was fully pubescent, she was so beautiful that stories got around and Theseus came and abducted her. She wasn't quite old enough to marry, but he ran off with her, and her brothers, Castor and Pollux, the Gemini twins, had to come and bring her back. There is one variant story where she was pregnant with Iphigenia, but we're going to get to that later this term. So Paris chooses Helen. Helen's abduction sets the whole conflict going. He heads off immediately to visit Sparta as part of a royal envoy from Troy. Some depict Helen as abducted against her will, like in this painting. She's like crying out and grabbing onto people, and he's dragging her off. This painting shows Paris holding her hand, but maybe gripping her wrist kind of hard. I don't know. Is that force? I can't read the expression on her face. Oh, and in this one, in David's painting, she totally looks into him, doesn't she? Notice Paris's Smurf hat. The Phrygian cap is an indication that he's from Asia Minor. Yeah, Papa Smurf. And Smurfette's totally into him here. In the Iliad, Helen does acknowledge her fault. She's talking to Hector and she says, "Oh, Hector, I'm a horrible, conniving bitch." Female dog is the word she uses. "I wish that on that day my mother bore me some evil wind had come and carried me away." So death wish because of her guilt in causing this war. Because of that and Paris's folly, Zeus gives us an evil fate so we may be subjects for men's songs in human generations yet to come, which is actually an adorable moment in the Iliad because she's acknowledging that she is a character in an epic that we are going to be reciting 3,000 years later, and basically trashing her character for being so evil and conniving. But my favorite poem about Helen is from Sappho, the great poetess from the island of Lesbos, whose hot erotic poetry for women gives us the terms lesbian and sapphic. In this poem, Sappho just points out that Helen is a great example of how love is the most powerful force, since no one is dumb enough to leave her parents and child and awesome, wealthy, powerful husband for a doofus like Paris, unless compelled by love. Some say a host of horsemen is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. Some say a host of foot soldiers. Some say a fleet of ships. But I say it is whatever one loves. I can easily explain this to anyone, for she who so far surpassed all humankind in beauty, Helen, Helen left her husband, noblest of men, to sail away to Troy, not thinking of her child or her parents, led astray by... Oh, and there the papyrus breaks off, and we don't know the next word. Beautiful poem, though. One sophist in the 5th century gives us a defense of Helen, Gorgias, around mid-5th century BCE. If love, being a god, has the divine power of gods, how could the weaker being have the power to reject this and to ward it off? ... How then is it necessary to regard as just the blame of Helen, who either passionately in love, or persuaded by discourse, or abducted by force, or constrained by divine constraints, did the things she did, escaping responsibility every way? But the because she was in love defense didn't work then any more than it works nowadays. She's still a hussy who caused a 10-year war and more deaths than any other woman in myth. But I want you to think about Gorgias, the sophist. I mean, this is a terrible argument. I can kind of understand the goddess of love compelled her argument. That's fine. But he even acknowledges that if she was persuaded by discourse, then it's not her fault that she left her husband. I don't know about that. In antiquity, there were alternatives that absolved Helen of guilt by removing her from the story itself. Most famously, Euripides tells the story that the Helen who accompanied Paris to Troy was a phantom, an illusion created by Athena and Hera to punish him for his bad judgment. This gets its first full telling in the 5th century BCE, but 100 years earlier, the poet Stesichorus was said to have written a poem called the Palinode, the recantation, in order to recant his own poetic condemnation of Helen. You know, he said Helen's a hussy, and then after writing that poem, he lost his sight. He went blind, and he regained his sight only after he wrote an apology to Helen, an apologetic verse called the Palinode. This is not a true story. You did not go in those ships with good benches. You did not come to the citadel of Troy. The story of Stesichorus is apocryphal, but Helen was a potent figure in classical Greece. There's a tomb of Helen has been found at Sparta, where she was worshipped as a protector deity of young women. She was a goddess. My own personal theory is etymological. Helen's name is the taken girl. So the notion of a stolen princess or a stolen goddess may go way back before all of the myths about Troy developed. Before Helen was even married, after her abduction by Theseus, I guess, there was worry over war on account of her beauty. She had already been kidnapped, when she comes of age, before choosing her husband from among all the leading men in Greece who all want to marry her, her father Tyndareus enforces an oath. Apparently it was Odysseus' idea. If everyone swears an oath to protect the person he chooses, then they won't all get together and just up and kill him. And everybody's willing to swear the oath because they're all hoping that they'd be the one chosen. So when Helen is kidnapped or seduced or whatever happened, all of the Greeks have to gather because of the oath that Tyndareus made them swear. And that's invoked when Paris makes off with Helen, and the armies gather from all across the Greek world at a place called Aulis in the Euboean, that little inland sea. Odysseus tries to avoid service and pretends to be crazy, but when somebody puts his infant son Telemachus in front of the plow that he's running through his fields, he turns it away, and they realize he's not crazy, so he has to go. Achilles is not actually part of the oath, but he's the greatest warrior of his generation. His mother, the nymph Thetis, knows that he's destined to die at Troy if he goes, and so to avoid this, she dresses him as a girl and hides him on the island of Skyros. When the Greeks go there, they line up all the girls and they set out gifts for them, dolls and makeup and that sort of thing, and a suit of armor and some weapons. And Achilles reaches out to grab the weapons, and they catch him. They realize that's a dude, that's Achilles. And so they convince him to accompany them because he wants the glory that he'll get if he shows up. When they all gather at Aulis, there's a problem because they can't get the wind they need to sail to Troy. The wind is against them all the time, and they wonder, like, it's been so long, it must be a god mad at us. So they find out that Artemis is angry because, well, one story is that Agamemnon killed a deer sacred to her, so he has to make it up to her. There's another better story that we'll talk about later on, but either way, it results in his having to sacrifice his own daughter. So the leader of the expedition, Agamemnon, has to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. This is not mentioned in the Iliad, but I think it might be alluded to vaguely, as we'll see. Two plays of Euripides touch upon Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon. One is actually just about the gathering at Aulis. The assembled Greek fleet is waiting, but they can't sail until they appease Artemis. Artemis, who says, "You're going off to Troy to destroy an entire city. All of their children will be dead. All of their future is dead. You need to offer one of your own children." So she demands the life of Iphigenia. Agamemnon, I guess he doesn't like it at first, but then he's like, "What's a daughter? Okay, we'll do it." Iphigenia at Taurus is a really cool play in which we find out that Iphigenia was rescued from that human sacrifice and is now what had been whisked away to barbarian lands where she's a priestess of Artemis in a place where they sacrifice humans. Her brother finds her and brings her back to Greek lands. I think you had to read a bit of Hellenicus so you'd be ready for understanding the curse that runs through the whole family of Agamemnon and the house of Atreus from the beginning, all the way down to Agamemnon being killed by his wife and avenged by his son. Great stuff. So let's take a moment to recap the backstory of the Trojan War, the real backstory, back when the walls of Troy are built. We already get prophecy of the fall of Troy. Zeus rapes Leda. Zeus gives Thetis away to Peleus. At their wedding, Eris causes some trouble among the goddesses. Paris stupidly steps into it, earning himself the most beautiful woman in the world and the destruction of his city and his family. Tyndareus, meanwhile, before marrying off Helen, had ordered all the suitors to swear an oath to support the winning suitor, which was Menelaus of Sparta, brother of Agamemnon. Paris comes by, takes her away, and the army is raised to destroy the city. Just a quick reminder, none of this is in Homer. I mean, it's alluded to in Homer, but the Iliad only describes 51 days of the 10th year of a 10-year-long war. But the epic cycle had included several other accounts. You read a summary of one called the Cypria. The summary is written by Proclus, a late antique philosopher, like way after these writings. The Cypria covered the story before the Iliad. The Aethiopus covers events after the Iliad, but before the end of the war. And then the Iliou Persis covers events leading up to and including the sack of the city. We'll look at that one now. It's one of the most useful accounts, but unfortunately lost. All we have are summaries and allusions to it. But yeah, the Persis Iliou, the sack of Troy, includes details like the kidnapping by the Greeks of the Trojan prophet Helenus, who tells them in the 10th year of the war the three things that they need to bring about the fall of Troy. They need the bow of Heracles, now held by Philoctetes because his father helped Heracles light his funeral pyre. They need Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, because I guess he impregnated one of those girls where he was hiding out in Skyros. And they need a statue of Athena called the Palladium. Later events involve the building of the wooden horse and a guy who tricks the Trojans into bringing it into their city, and a Trojan priest whose death makes it much more easy to believe that they should bring the horse into the city. Laocoon. Our best account of the Trojan horse is actually from the Roman poet Virgil. It's a shame that we don't have a contemporary account, although recently a papyrus was found with what looks like an account from a lost Euripidean tragedy of the building of the Trojan horse. Ask me about that sometime. What does Virgil say? Broken by war and held back by fate, the leaders of the Greeks, after so many years had slipped by, built a horse as big as a mountain, thanks to the skill of, I guess Athena helped. And they wove it side with planks from a fir tree. They fashioned it as if it were an offering for their voyage home. So the Greeks pretend that they're building a large wooden horse as an offering to the gods who will help them get home because they've given up. They're not going to fight anymore. Meanwhile, a Trojan priest named Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, says, "No, don't bring that horse into the city. We don't want its protection because it's obviously a trick. Timeo dona os et dona ferentes. I fear the Greeks even when bearing gifts." This is a statue. Oh, what a great statue. This is a sculpture group in the Vatican Museum of Laocoon and his children. I don't know why they're naked. I guess because why not? Poseidon, he's Poseidon's priest. After he gives a speech saying, "We don't want this," Poseidon, who wants Troy to fall, sends sea serpents gliding over the waves to strangle to death his priest and his two children. After which all the Trojans say, "Oh, well, I guess he was wrong. Let's bring this horse in the town." After the fall of the city, the Greeks commit many crimes during the sack, some of which cause the heroes to have trouble returning home. Especially important is Ajax's rape of Cassandra. This is the lesser Ajax, not the greater Ajax, son of Telamon. Neoptolemus kills Priam at the altar of Zeus. Ajax drags Cassandra away from a temple of Athena. There's a human sacrifice of a Trojan princess, Polyxena, on the tomb of Achilles. They throw Hector's baby child, Astyanax, from the walls of Troy. And all of the various Trojan women get handed out to Greek generals as war prizes, as sex slaves. Here's a brutal image of Neoptolemus killing Priam at an altar, and I guess the lesser Ajax pulling Cassandra away from the altar to rape her and kidnap her. Whew, let's take a step back. I want to tell you an amazing modern story about the Trojan War. On the left is Heinrich Schliemann, 1822 to 1890, a German businessman and an amateur archaeologist. Schliemann wondered about the Trojan War, which the Greeks believed happened around 1200 BC. By the end of the 19th century, though, scholars didn't really believe in the historical reality of Homer. Schliemann was a big fan, and he disagreed. This is actually before the discovery of the Minoans, so it's extra wacky and out there that he was sure that there was Homeric society and a Troy. But this wealthy businessman used his vast resources to purchase a site on the coast of Turkey where he believed, following Homer's accounts and geography, where he believed he would find the city of Troy. On the right, That's his wife, Sophie Schliemann. Isn't she beautiful? All decked out in the gold that he found. And so Schliemann digs in Hisarlik, Turkey, and finds a city. He finds a city full of gold and treasures, and he says, "This is Troy." We know now that there was a city in the area identified by the ancient Greeks as Troy. This city, or at least one of the cities on this site, was destroyed around 1200 BCE by war or earthquake or uprising or something. There are Hittite tablets that refer to a city called Wilusa, which may indicate Hisarlik. Considering that in the Greek tradition, Troy has two names, Troy and Ilion. Wilusa sounds suggestively close to the Greek word Wilion, because in early forms of Greek, Ilion was spelled with an initial W sound. Thus, Wilion and Wilusa may be the same name. Unfortunately, we don't know. Only one piece of writing has been found at the site, a pair of proper names. What we can say is that there was a major city in the area that the Greeks identified as Troy, and it may have been destroyed, at least one iteration of it, around the time of the supposed Trojan War. But beyond that, we have only Homer. And Homer, as we'll talk about now, is not a historical source. The scholars Ian Morris and Barry Powell offer a comparison to Le Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland. It's a telling parallel. That's a poem which, likely oral in origin, tells the story of the Battle of Roncesvalles during the Frankish invasion of Muslim Spain, in which Roland, a commander of the army of Charlemagne, is killed by attacking Basques. But the poem, in the manuscript we have from the 1100s, gets so much wrong, like even that the attacking army was not Basque Christians, but Muslims. Anyway, how can we imagine that Homer, whom even the ancient Greeks placed hundreds of years after the Trojan War, could have any knowledge of the specifics of the battle? Maybe that's an unfair comparison. Homer's validity as a historical source is doubtful mainly because it's literature, but the bigger problem is in what kind of literature it is. Oral poetry relies on a poetic language that obscures a lot of detail. So Homer writes in a poetic meter, dactylic hexameter, which means that the words he uses in the poem have to fit into the metrical shape of the line, the right rhythm, which is made of a series of long and short syllables. Throughout Homer, as anyone who has read the Iliad or Odyssey can attest, we encounter epithets, second names for heroes, such as Achilles, swift-footed, or Hera, ox-eyed, or Odysseus, much-knowing. What Perry realized is that these epithets have nothing to do with the situation in the plot. They're simply used to fill in different portions of the line. When Homer needs to end a line after mentioning Odysseus, he calls him godlike, because this fills out the last 5 beats. When Homer needs to end a line with a different line with Odysseus, he can use descended from the gods to begin the line. The epithets are related to the poetic meter, not to plot or character. This recognition led Perry to recognize a formulaic element in Homer, wherein formulas, name and epithet, shape the poem as much as plot and character. Perry and his student Lord traveled to Serbia in what was then Yugoslavia to do fieldwork among a living tradition of illiterate oral singers called guslari. Their instrument is called the gusla. By speaking to these singers, they realized that they did not learn a song word for word from a teacher, but rather, from an early age, they were immersed in the grammar of oral poetry, and they composed as they performed. So for the guslari, as likely for ancient Greek bards, they considered the poem the same when they repeated the elements and themes and event of a story. The guslari did not distinguish, as we literate people do, between words, phrases, or entire sequences of action. There's a specific story indicative of what's going on here. Perry and Lord experimented with one particularly talented Yugoslav bard. They told him a story for 20 minutes, and then he repeated it back to them, not word for word, but for about an hour, elaborating on all the details, entirely improvised, and he told it in poetic verse. The poetic language allows for the use of formulaic phrases that fill out metrical lines, making it possible to compose in verse while performing. If Homer and ancient bards were like the Guslari, singing a slightly altered, extended, expanded, or contracted version of the song each time they performed, then there was no text of the poems of the Iliad or the Odyssey. On the other hand, it emphasized that both that the Iliad and Odyssey are not cobbled together, like knitted together stories that are always told the same way, but also that there's not a single creative genius behind them. The character of Homer is a fiction. Instead, what we have now is the writing down of one performance of the epic poems, which had been, and probably continued to be, even after the recording of what we've got, sung differently at different times and places, well into the historical period. I would compare Homeric verse more to freestyle rap than to anything else. Another delightful aspect of Homeric verse is a tendency toward extended similes. Homer doesn't say, he attacked him like a lion. That's too simple. His poems say, he attacked him like a lion which spots a gazelle slinking back from the herd, timidly sipping at the stream, the weakest of the gazelles. And the lion rushes upon the beast with claws and teeth bared, and the gazelle tries to flee, but the lion cannot be avoided. Just so did Ajax rush upon the etc., etc. So we need to distinguish what the Iliad is about and what it's not about. The earlier events before the war, the judgment of Paris, everything that causes Achilles to be born, the sacrifice of Iphigenia, and then the after the Iliad events, like the actual sack of the city, the death of Achilles, because it's alluded to, but it's not in there. So what is the Iliad about? The Iliad, from its very first line, is the story of rage, of meanness, of the rage of Achilles. The Iliad is very much about Achilles' choice to die heroically rather than to have a long, uneventful life. The Iliad is about the community of heroes involved, and because it is the epic of a society, it is about how to be a good Greek. It's the story that the Greeks tell about themselves to themselves, a guide for proper semi-heroic life. It begins with an invocation of the muse. Aedithea, Menon Aedithea, Pelea deo Achilleos, Ulamanen he Muriachaio Algeatheca. Goddess, muse, sing about the rage of Achilles, the son of Peleus, the destructive rage which made countless pains for the Greeks. So in those first lines, in that first word, menin, the Greek word menis means rage. It means anger. But strangely, it's an anger that only the gods feel. The gods and Achilles. He's the only mortal who ever, in all of Greek literature, has menis. So maybe wrath is a good translation of it. The wrath of Achilles. Sing, goddess, the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, the destructive wrath which brought countless woes upon the Achaeans and sent forth to Hades many valiant souls of heroes and made them into spoil for dogs and feast for birds, in order that the plan of Zeus come to fulfillment. From the time when first parted in strife Atreus' son Agamemnon and Achilles, who brought about these two in contention, the son of Leto and Zeus. For he, in anger against the king, roused through the host an evil pestilence, and the people began to perish, because upon the priest Chryses, the son of Atreus, had wrought dishonor. Achilles is and his anger are the subject, but it all begins when he fights with Agamemnon, because Agamemnon dishonored a priest. Agamemnon had taken as his prize from the sacking of one of the cities near Troy. He had taken as his prize the daughter of the priest of that town. The priest came by to the Greek army with tons of gold, saying, "Here, please take this in payment for my daughter. Give her back to me." And Agamemnon said, "No, I don't feel like it. She's hot, and she is going to grow old serving me in my hometown, serving at the loom and in my bed. Back off, priest. Get out of here before I get mad at you." The priest prays to Apollo, the god of plagues. And Apollo comes through. The Greeks are hit with a terrible plague. They're dying, pyres of dead burning every day. And Achilles calls an assembly to say, "Let's get to the bottom of this." Agamemnon says, "Okay, yeah, maybe I'll give the girl back to her dad, but somebody will have to give me a prize. Somebody will have to make up for the fact that I'm losing my prize." This pisses off Achilles, who decides he's not going to fight for the Greeks anymore. He knows he's going to die. If he's going to be dishonored in this way, forget it. He's out. So his mother Thetis goes to Zeus, who says, "Okay, we'll let the Trojans win for a little while until the Greeks realize that they need to honor Achilles." As you read in book 1, the Greeks are all on the side of Achilles. Come on, honor the priest, give the girl back. But Agamemnon is a real tool. Achilles and Agamemnon share some pretty harsh words. Achilles, what is he upset about? He's upset because he does all the work. He sacks all of these towns. His fighting is what's really changing the tide of the war. And he only gets a small share of the booty afterward. Oh, booty is a terrible pun there. Agamemnon gets the choicest pickings from all of the booty, all of the prizes whenever they sack a town, even though Achilles did the work. "So what am I doing here?" he says. "I didn't swear an oath. The Trojans never did anything to me. There's a long way between Troy and Phthia, where I come from. So why don't I just go back there? My dad will find me a good bride, and I can just pretend this never happened." I thought that I should run you through the intervening books up to book 9. I hope that you went onto Wikipedia and read the short summaries that you can get of all the intervening books. Book 2 has not much going on. Agamemnon has a dream, and weirdly, a dream suggesting that he just attacked because he's going to win now. But he says, "Wait, no, I want to get the army behind me, so I'm going to tell them we're going home." And then there's a big fight. And much of book 2 is what we call the catalog of ships. Homer stops and says, "Wait, let me tell you about all the..." Homer, the poet, stops and says, "Wait, let me tell you about all of the Greek contingent." And he names all of the generals and how many ships they brought. And yeah, it totals 1,000 or so. And this is sort of, many people consider this the most boring part of the Iliad, the catalog of ships. But picture yourself as a Greek from some little nothing town somewhere in Greece. And yet in this epic, your town is named at one point because they sent warriors to Troy. And maybe you even think of one of the named people as your ancestor. It's a lot like, I guess, Genesis for the Israelites, that you know you're descended from these people. And so it's exciting even just to hear their names in a list of "he begat him, begat him, begat him." In book 3, they call a truce. They say, "We're going to stop the fighting and let Paris and Menelaus just fight a duel, and the winner gets Helen." That sounds great, but the gods are still determined to see this war through to the end. And so even though Paris gets beaten down by Menelaus, the gods make sure that the truce doesn't hold. Paris is not killed by Menelaus. Helen wraps him up in a cloud and takes him off to bed. Aphrodite wraps him in a cloud and takes him off to bed with Helen before he can die. So he's still a major character from then on. The truce is broken when a goddess convinces Pandarus, a Trojan, to go ahead and try to shoot Menelaus with his bow and arrow, and he wounds him, and everything crumbles. No more truce. Book 5 is mainly about Diomedes, a really wonderful badass Greek warrior who kills the guy who shot the arrow. He wounds Aeneas, a major Trojan prince. He actually fights the gods. He wounds Aphrodite and he wounds Ares, although Apollo says, wait, back off, dude, you don't want to do this. And he does back off. He wounds the gods. This is where Ares runs off to Zeus and says, ow, Diomedes hurt me. And Zeus says to his son Ares, shut up. Don't you know nobody likes you? You love war and contention and all of that. That's disgusting. We all hate you. Just go shut up. In book 6, the Trojans start really making inroads. Hector, the Trojan prince, is the main force on the field, and nobody can stop him. There's a lovely scene where Diomedes and the Trojan ally Glaucus, they're about to fight, but they want to know what's the name of the dude I'm about to kill? What's his ancestry? So they relate their ancestry to each other, and they realize that 3 generations ago, their great-great-grandparents knew each other and like had a meal together. And xenia, the Greek ideal of guest-host interaction, is so strong in their heads that they refuse to fight each other because they have this family bond. And so instead they exchange armor as gifts. One trades his bronze armor for the other's gold. Later in book 6, Hector goes home for a little bit. He sees his wife and his little baby. There's an adorable scene where he leans down to kiss his baby Astyanax, who cries because the big helmet frightens him. So he takes off the helmet and they all chuckle. It's adorable. It's referred to as the homilia, which is a word for social intercourse. But by the way, it also means sexual intercourse. So maybe he paused long enough to sleep with his wife. Book 7 is a bit of a flyover book. Hector duels Ajax, and you expect that that's going to be important, but they don't finish the fight before sunset. Paris makes an offer to refuse to return everything that he took except for Helen, but they're like, shut up. And the day is called off with a truce for gathering the dead. And so the Greeks fortify their camp on the beach. In book 8, well, that's a bit of a flyover book as well, but Zeus makes it clear that he's not going to let any of the gods interfere for a while. The Trojans do really well, force the Greeks all the way back to their camp, and just before they attack the wall of the camp, night falls, and they just agree that they're going to take on the Greeks, invade their camp in the morning. In book 9, as you know, the Greeks are desperate. Agamemnon finally says, okay, we need Achilles. I go ahead and tell him I'm sorry. I'll give him a whole bunch of treasure and gold. He can marry my daughter. I'll give him towns to rule. He can have all of this stuff. And he sends Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix. Phoenix is an old friend of Achilles. He sends them with 2 heralds to offer the girl back and whatever gifts he thinks are enough. The embassy shows up in Achilles' tent, and they have a wonderful time. They have a little feast, but Odysseus presents Agamemnon's offer, and Achilles isn't really into anything he says, so they fail. And that was really the problem. Odysseus was not the guy to present the embassy to Achilles. And Ajax and Phoenix knew this. They make like a hand gesture to each other to like start talking, and then Odysseus jumps in and says, my good friend, when your father Peleus sent you from Thea to Agamemnon, did he not say, son, check your high temper, for the better part is in goodwill, eschew vain quarreling, and the Achaeans old and young will respect you more for doing so. These were his words, but you have forgotten them. Odysseus like mansplains Achilles' father's words to him, and none of which could be remotely accurate, since Achilles' parents are just worried that he's going to die. After Odysseus is done, repeating the words of Agamemnon, none of which is an apology, but just offering him a bunch of stuff, which, by the way, even Agamemnon says, and then Odysseus repeats, it's all treasure that Achilles won when he was doing the battling for the Greeks earlier. Achilles responds to him, Echthros gar moi kenos amos aida opalesin, och sketeron men kauthani fresin alade. I hate like the gates of hell the man who hides one thought in his mind and speaks another. For me, this is a critical moment in the Iliad because we've got the greatest Greek hero of the Iliad, Achilles, the most honest and forthright man, talking to the hero of the Odyssey, talking to the sneakiest, craftiest, smartest assed Greek alive, and saying, you know, I hate people like you who make up crap and tell lies. Just be honest with me, man. And then he tells them, I know, everybody knows my fate. My mother, the goddess, tells me I'm going to die one of two ways. I can stay here and fight, and I won't go home, but I'll have glory unwilting, glory forever. If I go home, I won't have any glory, but I'll have a long life, long, pleasant life. So to the rest of you, I say, go home, for you will not take Iliad. Zeus has held his hand over her to protect her, and her people have taken heart. That phrase, kleos aphthaton, my glory unwilting, unwithering glory, that's really a symbol of what the Iliad is. It's the story of the glory of heroes that will live forever through Homeric song. These heroes will be talked about forever, and Achilles knows that, and that's what he chooses. He knows he's going to die one day. He'd rather have a short life, but be remembered forever. But what good is it if they're dishonoring him, if he's not actually having the glory? And so let's just consider some questions for review before we go on to the rest of the Iliad. There are a whole lot of feasting scenes. Pay close attention to those. In Book 1 and in Book 9, we see animals sacrificed a certain way and salted a certain way and fed to people a certain way. Think about the bonds between people as they share meat and bread and all of that, including the embassy. Think about how the various heroes from the rest of Greek mythology get mentioned along the way, or even if they aren't mentioned, how they compare with Achilles. Who is he, this undefeatable warrior, compared to somebody like Heracles or Perseus or that idiot Jason or that sort of half-man Theseus? Oh, I should have mentioned earlier, I love in Book 1 that Apollo is called Smintheus. When the priest prays to him and asks for a plague to fall upon the Greek army, he calls him Apollo Smintheus, which means mouse god. And of course, the major problem here in Books 1 and 9 is the fight between Achilles and Agamemnon. Like, what is at stake there? Achilles is willing to die for glory. Agamemnon is not willing to give Achilles more glory than himself, which makes sense. If he's the king, he can't be seen as second rate or he'll lose all his authority, right? Well, I guess Thetis's role in Book 1 is pretty straightforward. Zeus owes her one, and so she gets Zeus to help the Trojans, even though the other gods are going to be upset about this because they're all waiting to see how the war goes. And that leads to a scene in Book 1 where Olympus is just kind of funny. You know, the humans are fighting and a lot depends on it all. But when the gods start arguing and quarreling, first of all, Zeus is a big asshole and nobody can stop him. But the rest of it is that they end up just laughing together because nothing really matters to the immortals. Question 7 here is probably the most important because of the choice of Achilles, because he's trading his life for glory, for honor, for time. And time is a Greek word that means honor, but it also means value. It's a recognition that your honor is connected to the material value of what people give you. So when Achilles is denied his prize, he is being denied honor itself. So why then is he still angry after, in Book 9, they offer to give him back not only that prize, but so much more? They offer him honor and glory and recompense for what they did before. Why is he still angry? So keep thinking about that as you continue reading, and I'll talk to you next time.